So this panel it's kind of like a dream come true for me because I've always wanted a room where we can have activists who've been doing things for decades share their wisdom with younger activists and activists who are emerging and have been on the front lines, on the ground here now, and they can share what they're learning and what they're seeing in their social media presence with some of our older activists as well. So this is amazing. I'm just going to make a few introductions before we start. So right here we have Steve Downs. Steve Downs was a former chief counsel for the Commission of Judicial Conduct in New York State. He's the co-founder of Project Salam, and he's also the past executive director of NCBCI. Steve has been working with prison prisoners and their families for a number of years, and we'll want to hear more about his work. Next, I have Kathy Hammond. Kathy practices law in Albany, New York, and is involved in cases in which Muslims are prosecuted for what the government fears that they may do or for their ideology. It's based on Dick Cheney's 1% theory that there is 1% chance someone might do something, prosecute them, to prevent it. Think of the movie Minority Report. After 9/11, there was a struggle in which the view won out in all sections of the rulers that the focus needed to be on prevention through whatever means is necessary, rather than to prosecute for crimes actually committed. This was accomplished by massive changes like the Patriot Act. Kathy has been involved in several cases involving Muslims being prosecuted, like the Newburgh Court case in New York City. And then we have activist Lynn. I wanted to apologize. We had a little bit of mixed up, my fault. But we want to welcome Lynn, and she's a part of Project Salam as well, and she got involved after the Yasin Arab case. Next to Lynn is Daraksha Raja. Daraksha is the co-director of the Washington Peace Center. So Daraksha is a Pakistani Muslim immigrant from the Bronx who moved to DC in order to impact social policies. She's also the co-founder of the Muslim American Women's Policy Forum and serves on the advisory board for API Domestic Violence Resource Project. Recently, Daraksha has been focusing on supporting grassroots efforts and moving resources for activists and organizers directly impacted by state violence and increased collaboration between movements to move towards intersection, organizing, and collective liberation. And Fahad is the executive director of Macy's Rising Out and Moving from New York City. He's been involved, also an attorney, and he's been involved with Trump for 16 years. So Fahad is at a lot of times when I've seen Fahad's work, it's been on immigration rights, the Dream Movement, and he's also very involved with a lot of the moms that you had just heard speaking up about their children being incarcerated by accident. So inshallah, we have this amazing panel here, and so I'm going to pass it on. So the focus today is going to be what is actually going on the ground. Here, definitely, you see things in the newspapers. What's actually going on? So.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. My name is Lynn Jackson, and I'm going to talk briefly about some of the things that we have done in Albany, New York. The first thing I'd like to speak about is what's called the Albany Resolution. And this is a resolution that was passed by the Albany City Council. I have copies here, and I hope if anyone wants one, that you will take one at the end. I'll leave them here. The Albany Resolution in Albany, there was a case of Yassine Araf and Mohammed Hussein, and they were wrongfully prosecuted. It was an informant case, and it was pretty outrageous. They were sentenced to 15 years in prison. Out of that, we realized that we needed to ask the government to stop doing this. And Steve Downs found that the Inspector Generals had a report that said that these cases should be looked at. So I went to my common council member, Dominic Casolero, and I asked him to please put together a resolution. So a resolution was drafted with Steve and Dominic and a few other people, and we went to the Albany City Council. Now, the important thing is, what happened with the resolution? So what I did is, the Albany City Council has 15 members, and I went personally and met with about 8 of them and explained this issue, because this issue was a little complicated, and I went and explained the issue and asked for their support. And then, on the day that Dominic was going to put the resolution on the calendar of the Albany City Council, I asked all my friends to come and speak. And so Maury Salakan came from Maryland, so all the way to Albany, New York, by the way. We had people come from the Newburgh 4Ks, from the Schmoors came, the Dukes came, from the 465 came, many people came. And in the city of Albany, you can address the council for 5 minutes. Anybody in the world can come and talk to the Albany City Council. And so people came from all around, and we spoke for 2 hours about this issue of preemptive prosecution of Muslims, which is what we were addressing. And in the end, the Albany City Council realized that this was a really important thing, and they passed it with tremendous support. It was a 10-0 win. And I'm hoping that other people will take up this resolution and have it passed in their own city councils. Because the really important thing about doing this is passing the resolution is it raises the issue so people have to look at this issue of injustice and try to do something about it. So that's one of the things we're doing in Albany. More recently, we did a voter registration drive, and it is very important to vote because politicians look at who votes, and if people in your neighborhood don't vote, the politicians know that. They may not know how you vote, but they know that you do vote. And so it's really, really, really important to register to vote and to vote. So we went to 2 mosques in the Albany area, and we registered about 133 people to vote, and it was a really great thing to do. Some of the other things that we've done is, one of the problems that we have in Albany is that there, in proportion of the population, of course we know Muslims, there's not a lot of Muslims compared to other people. And so at some of our fairs in Albany, we have this big fair called the Tulip Festival, and everybody comes out, and it's in the park, and it's on a sunny day, and it's beautiful, so we did a Ask a Muslim table. And it was a wonderful thing to do. We went with, I made a tablecloth that says Ask a Muslim, and we just sat there and talked to people all day and had a wonderful time. It was a great way to engage people and to talk to people, passers-by. It was a wonderful thing. Then, more recently, what happened is our sheriff in Albany, the Albany County Sheriff, wanted to introduce new regulations that when you were at the Albany airport, if you turned away, like if you went through the first screening, but you were supposed to go, no, wait a second, that once you went, like, you go to board and you get your boarding pass, and then you go to the checkpoint, and then you go through the screening, that if you turned away after you went past the point where you were going to go to the screening, that they could arrest you. And we all thought that was a really bad plan because we all knew who that was targeted at. So many people went down to the Albany County Legislature and said, this is a really bad idea. They probably had 15, 20 people speak against it, and the only person who spoke for it was from the police department or the sheriff's department or something. So fortunately, the Albany County Legislature did not pass that, but it was really, really important that we go down and speak to them about that issue. And the final thing I want to mention is that recently we put together a group called the Capital Area Coalition Against Islamophobia. And We're very concerned. This happened after Donald Trump made his first comments about Muslims, which was pretty terrifying. And we realized that this could be a big problem. The coalition is a group of religious and groups and a mosque and people who are interested in the community. And the Albany City Council and the Albany County Legislature both passed resolutions in support of our Muslim neighbors, and they're very important resolutions. They really raise the issue of Islamophobia. So that's why some of the things, there's a few things we're doing in Albany.
Hi, can you hear me now? Okay. I'm Steve Downs, and I'm working with Kathy and Lynn on Project Salam to try to deal with a lot of the issues that have come up involving Islamophobia, particularly since 9/11. One of the things that Project Salam did was it went out and tried to identify all of the cases of preemptive prosecution in the country. And we ended up making a database, and I think Kathy's going to talk about that, of several hundred, probably. She'll tell you what the exact number is. But my effort over the last decade, probably, is to tell the story about these people. The way they are being portrayed in media and on public television and so on, is that there are these anonymous people coming to America to tell us, to harm us, and we don't know who they are or why they're doing it, but they are terrorists. In fact, these are people who mentioned at the first panel. These cases were all fake to begin with, and the people have suffered, and you need to understand their story in order to understand why the government's narrative is incorrect. So we've been experimenting with different ways of telling this story. We've had panels and going around to different venues and giving lectures, and we always try to include members of the impacted families in these panels. We've talked to mosques, we go to churches, we go to universities, wherever we can get there. We've also written a lot of articles, we've published books and so on. Kathy will tell you more about that. But one of the things that I became aware of, I think, at this point, is that it seems like fewer and fewer people actually have time to read anything. More and more we look to the television, to our iPad, to our other ways of getting it, particularly visual ways. So one of the things we've been experimenting with is making movies. And just recently I was over in Europe with Ellie Bernstein, who is making a movie about global Islamophobia, this phenomenon that you see where all of the Western countries are somehow focusing their attention on how do we repress our Muslims. And they're all doing it in many of the same ways, but each one has to deal with their own individual legal system. And so they have different ways that they actually can do it, although the overall intent is the same. One of the cases, I just want to bring it up because it was so striking, one of the things that we found, for example, in the UK, they had a program over there called Prevent, which they had existed for about 10 years. And it was a way of kind of institutionalizing Islamophobia. It essentially told professionals, teachers, doctors, other kinds of people that if they saw something about their Muslim clients that raised suspicion, that they had to report it to the police, and the police would then go after and track them down and presumably create dossiers and do other kinds of things. And we actually talked to families over there that had gone through this process. One kid in school, for example, during a discussion about ecology, talked about eco-terrorists. And because he used the word eco-terrorist, it was assumed that he must have some connection with terrorists, and so he was referred to the police, who therefore afterwards, interviewed him. And nobody told the family what the result of it was. So the kids were all living in terror themselves in that family, and in effect said, we will never speak in class again. And that's what happens, because they're monitoring what we say. Well, that kind of a program is now being brought to the United States. It's called CVE, it's Countering Violent Extremism. And just this weekend, we encountered a couple of students from Minneapolis who were out there struggling to counter the effects of this in their own community out there. Now this is a story we simply have to tell, and as it happened, Ellie Bernstein was out in Minneapolis actually filming situations that were happening out there involving CVE. So this is one way we're going to try to put together a film that will actually tell this story. And the final thing I just want to mention is a particular case. I'm a lawyer, and we've been asked by the family to represent this particular person, but the case itself, the case of Afia Siddiqui, is such an unusual case that I just want to mention it here. Dr. Afia Siddiqui is a Pakistani national, graduate of Brandeis and MIT. She has a PhD. In 2003, she went back to Pakistan with her 3 children. And in March of 2003, she was kidnapped off the streets of Karachi with her 3 children and disappeared. Simply disappeared for 5 years. We now believe that she was kidnapped at the request of the U.S. government, and that she was turned over and held at a black site somewhere, probably in Afghanistan, for about 5 years. Now, that by itself wouldn't be bad enough. To be captured, to be disappeared, there are treaties against disappearance. People should not be disappeared. And every government involved has a requirement that they do everything they can to prevent that and to make restitution to people who are so harmed. And in the course of this, one of Dr. Siddiqui's children was killed, we believe. We don't know for sure, we've never been informed, but we believe it to be true. So it's a very serious situation that happened. But what happened after that was even worse, in a way. In 2008, she appeared in a disheveled, confused state in Ghazni, Afghanistan, and was picked up by the police and brought into a police station. The U.S. was notified, and they said, oh, we want to talk to her. So a group of soldiers went over to the police station the next morning to interview her. They walked into a room and shot her. She wasn't killed, she was shot twice. They took her out, flew her to the United States, and charged her with the crime of attempted murder of the soldiers that shot her. The evidence was, or claimed to be, that she had picked up a gun and shot twice at the soldiers, and that the soldiers had then shot her in retaliation. And there's rather vivid testimony of the soldiers standing there watching while she shoots at them, and the bullets go into the wall behind them, and they're hit in the face by this splattering of blood off the wall and so on. In fact, the FBI went through the complete forensic examination of the room and found no bullets in the wall or any damage to the wall. The whole thing seems to be completely concocted. So here she is now in Texas in a prison, and her case calls out at a very high level to people all around the world, people who have been disappeared, mothers whose children have been shot or disappeared, people who have been neglected or have been abused by the legal system. All of them sort of come together in this case, and I think it's a case that calls everybody to stand up and say, enough is enough, something has to be done about this case, she should be at least repatriated and sent home. This is one of the cases that we are very involved in, and we want to raise public awareness of this case so that we can move forward and get some kind of a resolution for it.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Kathy Manley, a lawyer from Albany, New York, also, and I got involved in these cases in 2006 through the case of Yasin Ara, who was entrapped in one of these ridiculous FBI sting operations. And Yasin, he got sentenced to 15 years. He's got a couple more years. He's friends with Shahina Parveen's son, Shahwar Martin Siraj, and also with Reem, who spoke up here, her father, Kimajit Jayusi, because he met both of them in prison in the communication management unit. So there's a lot of connections between all these cases and the families that have gotten together and the people that get together in prison. And we, in Project Salam, helped form the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms in 2010. And one of our projects after that was to study all these cases in a kind of methodical way, where the Department of Justice came out in 2010 with a list of 400 cases that they called domestic terrorism cases. And we knew a lot of the names on that list, and we knew that these people were not actually terrorists. And so we decided to study every single one of those cases and look at what actually happened, if anything, right? What the people were accused of doing, and what happened with the cases. And we kind of looked at it through the viewpoint of what we call preemptive prosecution, which is defined as I think it was mentioned in the introduction, where the government, based on the 1% theory, where there's a 1% chance that somebody might be doing something bad, you have to go after them to prevent that from happening in the future. So that's what these prosecutions are. So they use various methods to do that, such as sting operations, such as material support for terrorism charges, based on charitable giving, where there's no intent to help support any violence, but they just use this as a way to go after people and lock them up. So out of those 400 cases, we found that that 74% of them were entirely preemptive prosecution, where no real crime, other than like through a sting operation or something, no real crime that we would think of as criminal was actually committed. 74% were pure preemptive prosecution. And actually probably 95% or more, nobody was killed, nobody was hurt, wounded, no property was stolen, no sexual assault, no any kind of crime that we would think of as a normal kind of crime that we would think of as criminal. None of that happened in virtually any of these cases. So 74% were completely preemptive prosecution. 94% had elements of preemptive prosecution, where there might have been some low-level crime going on, like maybe some kind of internet theft scam, but it was like something that if the people hadn't been Muslim, they would have just got maybe a couple years probation, and that would have been it. But because they were Muslim, the government threw on some kind of connection to terrorism, and they got enhanced sentences, things like that, where there was, so only 4 out of the 400 cases involved actual acts of violence or attempted violence in the United States. So almost all of them were not really terrorism cases. That's what we discovered. And we published our report in 2014. And one of the techniques that the FBI uses when they want to go after people is what they call false statements charges. Because they will come to you and want to speak to you and say, oh, don't worry, you're not in trouble, I just want to talk to you for a few minutes, you know. And it's kind of hard to say no. They're pretty good at getting people to talk to them. And then they'll ask them more and more questions, and then maybe they'll wait another 6 months, and they'll come back and just a few follow-up questions, and they'll ask the same exact questions. And they'll look for any little discrepancy, because normally when people are interviewed multiple times, there will be little discrepancies. And they can charge you with a crime based on that. So I've dealt with, people where I had to be really careful, because unfortunately that person did talk to the FBI before they called me. And so I have to, realize that they could be facing this charge based on not really doing anything wrong, but they can be infectious based on these little discrepancies, or they can lie about it because they don't report it to you. So, that's why it's so important. We do Know Your Rights workshops in the community, to youth and different groups sometimes, to, dealing with the police, regular police, but also the FBI. And when it's federal, you can be charged with a crime for what they call lying to them, whether you're lying or not. They'll come up with something if they want to. So that's why it's so important not to talk to them, to call a lawyer, or just tell them to give you their card, and you then can find some lawyer, hopefully CARE, National Lawyers Guild, or us, Project Salam, or NCPCF, and we'll we'll deal with it. And usually when that happens, that's the end of it. And like I will call them up and say, I represent this person, I told them not to talk to you, and usually that's the end of it, because they're just doing a fishing expedition and they're trying to get leverage on people and they're trying to convince them to be informants, right, by getting leverage on them. So please don't talk to them without a lawyer. One of the projects that we've been involved in over the last couple of years is in certain cases we filed commutation petitions to President Obama because I was thinking that it's the end of his term. You know, these are political cases. A lot of times the Republicans would go berserk if a president was to grant clemency to one of these cases and then they run for re-election. So it was a time when there wouldn't be any political repercussions for Obama, and Bill Clinton did this at the end of his term. He granted pardons to a bunch of Puerto Rican nationals, political prisoners, commutations, let them out of prison. So I thought this was a good time to file these. So we filed, I couldn't do that many, I was pretty much working on them by myself along with Steve and a couple other people, but we filed, we were supporting 7 of them. 2 people did their own. But one of the ones that was done was for Afia Siddiqui. And I just, you know, we collected letters and petitions in support of these, you know, but these cases aren't that widely known in this country. So we have, you know, maybe 20 or 30 letters for, you know, from the people that knew the prisoners. And we might have a petition with 300 signatures or something, not a whole lot. But just to say that what can happen when there is widespread awareness of the cases, for Afia Siddiqui, that case is so famous in Pakistan that they sent me literally about 5,000 letters. I mean, I submitted 11 volumes of letters that are like this thick, and there's more coming. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that can happen when these, you know, the movement happens to support these cases, and it can make a big difference. There's entire classes of school children in Pakistan who draw pictures. They're in color, really beautiful, and then they get emailed to me and I send them to a color printer and I have like stacks of them and I want to make them into a book. They're really amazing. All the things that the school children would say in there, and just imagine that kind of movement here, you know, when you have that, you know that you're onto something when you get the children involved. So, I guess that's all I have.
I'm just curious, out of that 400, say you worked on only 7 of those, what happens to the 400 that you identified? Well, not the 400, but that how many that you identified that were not truly, whatever that term is, that you, what happens now?
Right, I can't file petitions for all those cases, so I had to have criteria where the people asked, the family members had to be asking me to do it, and it had to be a case that didn't already have an appeal pending or another kind of collateral proceeding pending. So, you know, I could only do a few of them for the commutation petitions. Yeah, because it's just, our group is a volunteer, you know, I can't do that much. I wish we had a lot more resources and we could do more.
Good evening. I think so for context, to understand the present, we start with the past. I always start with recognizing that we are standing on ground and living in a country that was founded on the genocide of indigenous people and the theft of their lands. We are standing on land and living in a country that was built upon the backs of enslaved African people and their labor. And so that is very much in the DNA of this country from its inception. And if we keep that historical context in mind, we understand what's happening now a little bit better. And so the framing that we use a lot in Drum to think about these things is the war abroad and the war at home. The war abroad, I think people understand. It's the tanks, it's the bombs, it's the planes that are in Iraq or in Libya, that are in 130 countries across the world that the U.S. has military bases in. But we can't provide clean water to people in Flint, right? So that's the war abroad, but then the fact that we can't provide water to people at home means that there's a war at home too. It just looks different. And for me, I always think about, you know, when you see differences, like what do differences signify? To me, it signifies a lot about people's priorities, about a system's priorities. And so while white supremacists run amok in this country, have militias, engage in the most number of terrorist acts of any other group, our country spends millions and millions and millions of dollars entrapping young people with IQs of 79, with paranoid schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and then spends millions and millions of dollars putting them on trial, and then spends millions of dollars to incarcerate them. What kind of priorities does a country have? For people in the inner cities, you know, I work in New York City with working class South Asian communities, young people struggling to get decent education, struggling to get decent jobs, but we can put 38,000 police officers on the street to stop them, frisk them, harass them on an everyday basis just for walking in their own neighborhood. What does that say about our priorities? In New York City, we got schools that don't have paper, that don't have new desks. Some of our students are using history books from 2000. A history book, an outdated history book in school. In Hillcrest High School, teachers can bring in a ream of printing paper. They will give you extra credit because the teachers don't have money to buy paper. But that same school has 4 officers inside the school and has about 6 officers that patrol the school on the outside in the morning and in the afternoon when kids are coming to and going to school. We don't have paper, we don't have desks, we don't have updated books, but we spend $400 million a year in New York City in the name of school safety. And you know, like whenever the shootings happen, they're not in the city. They're out in Colorado, they're out in like white suburban neighborhoods. So what does that say about priorities? Our immigration system, we keep at a minimum 34,000 immigrants in detention because there's a quota to keep people in jail. Quota promoted by corporations who run the same private prisons. If you set up a quota, you're going to do whatever you can to fill the quota. And then, so to me, how else do we understand what's happening at home aside from it's a war on poor people, it's a war on black people, it's a war on immigrants, it's a war on Muslim people, it's a war on other marginalized people. There's no other way to understand it but that. And so that's why we use this framing of war abroad and the war at home. And then to say that these two things are very much interlinked. The policies, the practices that we institute here are the ones that we export abroad. So for example, you know, some of the stuff that we saw in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, it was actually people from like federal prisons and state prisons here who joined the military and were like, hey, let me teach y'all something. We could do this to prisoners. We could do that to prisoners. Right? And so those pictures that we see coming out, those are things that are happening here in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, in Alabama on a regular basis. And then the practices that they develop abroad, they bring them back home. So technology that they're using in Afghanistan, stuff that they're using in Iraq, surveillance techniques, a lot of these things are things that were perfected by the Israelis for many, many years. So there's this relationship of things, the war abroad and the war at home are very much connected to each other. And sometimes it's very, very concrete ways. There's a program right now underway for the past decade called the 1033 program. And the military, which spends all this money buying equipment, weapons, and vehicles from private companies, when they don't use the equipment, they gift it to local police stations, not police stations, police departments, including university security departments, including high school and like public school security departments. And so in LA, there are schools that have machine guns in their stockpile. And so like, to me, it just raises the question of like, what's going on in our society? And so in that context, if we, just to briefly bring it back to the topic that was being talked about, these cases of entrapment, we understand them as very much a part of the war at home and the war abroad. These cases provide legitimacy to the U.S. military abroad to say that, look, this is why we're over there, because of these people. It provides funding for the police departments and their intelligence divisions here. Every time they make a case, they take it to city council, they take it to the Senate, they take it to the House. Hey, we need more money if you want us to put these people away. And most importantly, what it does is it causes fear in the same communities that should be speaking out, and tells them, y'all better stay quiet or next one's you, right? And so it allows this machine of war at home and war abroad to continue over and over again. Just the last thing I want to say is sort of the purpose of saying this thing. It's not to scare you, but I think we have to be realistic about sort of what's going on. It's also not to promote conspiracies. While there's a lot of stuff you have to be skeptical of, like, I think we do have to have our understanding be grounded in like real facts, and that sometimes we get carried away with conspiracies as well. And then lastly it's this strange balance that when the system is just so bad, part of it is just like, how do you even reform something so horrible? How do you reform like police departments and courts that can never ever even get a damn indictment for killing people? Not like even like we're not even taking them to trial, right? Like being caught on camera choking people out, shooting people, and can't get an indictment. So on one hand, it's just like the system needs to be fundamentally transformed. It can't be reformed. It needs to be transformed. But the reality is also that our movements in the U.S. are extremely weak. We can't even reform. Like, we're that weak. And so we do have to engage in reform struggles to learn how to fight, to learn how do we pull ourselves together, how do we take the Muslim mothers and the black mothers and the Latina mothers, how do we get them to understand each other, how do we get them to demand things that are inclusive of everyone and not feel like, oh, like why are they getting attention and we're being silenced, oh, why are we doing this, why are they doing that? We have to learn how to fight, to learn the skills of fighting, but also to build our forces.
Thank you so much for that, Fahad, and also the work of Drum, which has definitely been an inspiration to us out here doing work in the district. I do want to piggyback on something Fahad said, which is, providing more context. And so I want to go a little bit deeper into particularly the war on terror. Since 9/11, and we know the war on terror conceptually goes back even further than that, but I'll start from 9/11. Since 2001, we're talking about 7 Muslim majority nations have been bombed. At least 1.3 million Muslims have been killed just since 2001. This does not include the fact that the 2 largest producers of refugees countries, Syria, Afghanistan, that in addition to the death, the destruction, the devastation of borders being destroyed, identities being destroyed, infrastructure, hospitals, schools, your own history being destroyed has happened since then. And so when you talk about Muslims in America, the first Muslims in America were black African slaves who were brought here. So Islam, from the beginning, has never been accepted in America. It's always presented a threat to white supremacy, and it has presented a threat to empire. But right now, in terms of post 9/11, what have we seen? We see a further entrenchment of seeing Muslims only through the paradigm of national security. If you're watching any of these political debates between Hillary or Trump, both of them state that the only role that Muslims in America are to play is to fight extremism, is to report, is to be the front line. It is not a coincidence that the Hillary Clinton's campaign, whose Khizr Khan, whose son went in a war in Iraq. When you think about the logic of the war on terror, it is anti-Muslim at its core. It is completely against working class folks. It is against communities of color. But to turn around and to tokenize a story and say, this is what you Muslims in America need to play. Go kill your people. Go center the fact that you are to fight extremism and radicalization, which is constructed as a Muslim-only problem. Even though we talk about objectively where the threat of terrorism in America comes from, it is the KKK, it is white supremacist groups, it is the Tea Party. But they are never seen through that lens because that is so integral to how America sustains itself. Then it is what Fahad mentioned, the war abroad and the war at home. Muslims, in terms of the paradigm in which we are seen through, is the war paradigm. Because militarism, which is one of the most central ways in which America sustains its power, it needs to always create an enemy. And that enemy right now is the Muslim body. And when I say the Muslim body, I'm not just speaking to people who are religiously Muslim. I'm speaking to the racialization of Muslim, which means anyone who is immigrant, foreign, anyone who has indicators and markers of religiosity. But there are plenty of Muslims who might not necessarily be practicing, who have been completely lumped under that category. If you see the ways in which some white supremacists talk about Muslim communities, the term Muslim is a slur. They're not using it as just an identifier of the group, they're using it as something that is seen as the enemy that America has to fight or they have to fight. And so, if we leave that paradigm out when we are trying to tackle Islamophobia, tackle all of these domestic policies, we're misplacing our efforts. And so the work that I do, and I will speak specifically just to Washington, D.C., because that's where the work that I do with the Muslim Women's Collective as well as the Washington Peace Center, what we're seeing, particularly from a gendered lens. So a few years ago, as somebody who started out as a rape crisis counselor, and that's sort of where I was based out of, a string of cases happened of particularly Arab women who'd been sexually assaulted by a white man. This white man was basically threatening these women and saying that if they came forward to report, he would report them as terrorists. And so you can imagine the very real fear in this environment under the domestic laws around the war on terror. The evidence is literally, the bar is so low, you can just accuse somebody, and it doesn't really matter if the person did anything or not. And it actually doesn't, that's not even what we're about. We're not actually, the war on terror is not really about fighting terrorism. It's actually about continuing U.S. empire, it's continuing the fact that U.S. militarism is a pillar of it. In order to be proactive about it, myself and a few others, I reached out to some of the civil liberties groups that particularly represent Muslim communities. Now, any of you who work around the gender-based violence piece know that our civil rights communities have really done a terrible job in centering the ways in which women, queer, femmes, trans folks are actually impacted by state violence. And so that narrative is lost, and the only ones that we center are men impacted by state violence. That is not to say it's not important, it is, but the story has literally erased many of us out of the paradigm. And so I met with particularly MPD, which is the local police department, their sexual assault unit. The kind of Islamophobia I heard from that unit, this idea of what is the relevance of this, why are you not focusing on the men who are really the rapists? When I asked them, have they even had any reports, their point was, we haven't had any reports. And the reason they use that is to say that the issue does not exist. And so for me, as someone, again, who's been trying to do this work for a while, this sort of, it hit home to me that where are the groups and organizations that center Muslim women's leadership in this work, and also center Muslim women, and the ways those are racialized as Muslim are experiencing gender-based violence. And so that's how we came together. Now, in the past few years, more reports, I'm not saying that necessarily this is an increase in incidents, but we're hearing that Muslim women particularly are being targeted in a very unique way. So our sisters who wear the headscarf, we've seen an increase of hate crimes against them, even locally in Washington, D.C. In addition, the particular narrative around the terrorists for a very long time was only focused on men. But if you look at recently, they've started talking about Muslim women as the ones that are radicalizing the men, so the foreign Muslim women. This happened particularly after San Bernardino with the wife who was a Pakistani woman. They pretty much made the story of that it's these foreign Muslim women who are really the influence on these men who are American Muslim men. And so we're seeing that even in terms of gender policy, programs like Countering Violent Extremism have started to talk a little bit more about particularly Muslim women being radicalized. Now, what are the dangers of that? The dangers of that is for those of you who've been connected to the DV and sexual assault work, post 9/11, one of the leading reasons why individuals stopped reporting and stopped seeking services was the fear of them being used to basically do these counterterrorism investigations. And there have been moments where people have put that forward as a suggestion to do so. The other thing we're seeing is particularly under suspicious activity reporting. We just had a recent individual who reached out to me in DC where the Metro cops that we had, someone reported her because she basically had her phone out, and the Metro cops pulled her aside, took all her information, went through her entire phone. Pretty invasive process, which now we're trying to actually have a meeting with WMATA out here around transportation, but particularly Metro cops. And so that brings me to the kind of work we're doing. Number one, the analysis around Islamophobia has been thus far very much centered around just interpersonal forms of violence, so hate crimes. What has not been connected is how that is deeply entrenched into the war on terror and state policy. And so the work is quite not connected at this point. So for us, our frame of analysis around Islamophobia is to center state violence. It is to keep it an extension of, as Fahad mentioned, how America came to being, so understanding its connectedness to anti-blackness, to racism, to settler colonial violence, because without that positioning, it makes Muslims look as if we're some separate group, as if none other group has actually experienced this. It also erases the intersectionality within the Muslim community. So when we're talking about the largest racial group, we know that it's Black Muslims who are the largest racial group. We're not just being hit because of our Muslim identity. We also have people being hit because of class, because of their immigration status, because of their race, because of their gender. And so that's the kind of work we've been doing, particularly in response to the militarism piece. We have now partnered with a group called U.S. Labor Against War, where we're nationally going to labor unions who have been also involved in the anti-war work, and we're doing a national series of particularly doing trainings with various labor unions around Islamophobia. So that's one project. The second project that we've been doing is particularly around locally in the district, is being more involved in work around gender justice. And so one particular thing that happened is around the work around street harassment in the district. And so we were successfully able to actually amplify the ways in which particularly Muslims are being harassed, and Muslim women in general. So there's going to be a great campaign that is coming out of that. The third piece that we're also doing in DC is we're building a rapid response network. And the reason we're doing that is because in moments when certain spikes happen, and that's particularly after news hits around terrorist attacks or so forth, we know that there's a vicious vilification by politicians and also the media. And so we see these spikes of hate violence, or at least what's being reported to us. And so for that, we're trying to build an active body of people who can come out physically and organize and be present. Because if we're not physically there, if we don't fight, no one's going to do it for us. So that's the work that we're doing.
I'm going to take a question. I just wanted to tie everything that we've heard since the morning. I wanted to tie everything that we've been hearing since the morning. So we realize now that there is a separate justice system for minorities, for Muslims, for African Americans, for Latinos. We realize this after hearing all of this. Now, what do we do about it? The work that you are doing, how do we support it? What is the next step for someone who's perhaps never heard of anything? They just heard you guys, their eyes open, they unplugged from the matrix, and now what's next? So if someone could talk about that, and let me take some and perhaps some of the questions that the audience has, and also
Speak up.
Getting the Muslim society involved in, all of the studies, all of the businesses and everything, and all of the everything else as far as, Islamophobia, how do we go from here in order to educate, Muslim, public, and to get them more involved in what we're talking about right now, because if we don't have unity and cohesiveness, we will not be able to do anything together or accomplish anything, you know. So we can support, you know what I'm saying? All of the citizens, you know, all of the, you know, people who want justice and equality for all people. This is what I'm talking about right now.
You know, I really didn't talk a lot at all about like sort of the day-to-day work that I do. I work with an organization called Drum, Bases Rising Up and Moving. Shahina, who you heard on the earlier panel, is one of our members. She's one of our nearly 3,000 members who are impacted by national security policies, by immigration policies, by the policing issues, by the school policing issues as workers. And I think one of the fundamental things I think about, the point I made about learning how to fight is, you know, it's not like we need to change. I don't believe that we need to change somebody's mind. I do think, you know, there's, by and large, some people have a very, very deeply vested interest in things being the way that they are because it's profitable for them, or just fundamentally like they're committed, racist, bigoted sort of people. And I particularly mean the people in power. I actually don't mean the people that we usually are told to target, like, you know, other poor people from other communities, but like the people in power. And so for me, it's they have the power and we don't. And the question is, how do we build our power and take away their power? So one of the things that means is it can't be just me. Or it can't be like 20 people like me, people that have like been to college, I got a decent job, if things get too hot, if need be, I can move to something else. How do we really bring in people who are the people that are daily suffering from these things? And so in our organization, by and large, like you won't really see me speak that often, it's largely people like Shahina, it's undocumented youth, it's workers that are being paid $3, $4 an hour. They're the people that we're out on the streets talking to, recruiting them, bringing them into the organization, having them talk collectively about what their problems are and collectively coming up with their solutions. And then collectively fighting. And then through collectively fighting, sometimes we lose, sometimes we win, but the lessons we draw from that is what teaches us how to fight, and how to fight better. And so it's that process, and it's like a cyclical process. You got to keep doing it over and over again, which teaches us how to fight and builds our power. Just a second point is, I'll pass that.
Sure.
What's going to happen after this? Find the person that.
Sure, so I personally just want to talk about the piece of mobilizing and organizing Muslims, because that's, if I'm understanding the question correctly, that was part of what you were asking. So number one, I think it's identifying that there are some serious risks to being a Muslim organizer and being president. And particularly the level, and this goes back to, right, for a very long time via COINTELPRO and even before that people who are in the movement and leaders, and we want leaderful movements, are targeted by the state in very heavy ways. So the surveillance apparatus targets them, many of our leaders are put in prison, some are extrajudicially killed, the vicious smearing of organizers and activists, the risks that you face, and that's very real for many Muslims who step into this work and center the state. So for example, a few weeks ago, we tried to do a healing circle just centering Muslims, and we found out there was an informant in the room, right? And the risk, again, that you face. So I think understanding that there needs to be institutions and folks who can legally provide protection to our activists and organizers is really important. How to sustain people once they join the work. Because you can have uprisings, you will have moments, and people will get politicized, and then it's trying to sustain that energy, holding them, learning, as Fahad said, yes, you can be, I mean, for me, I entered this work as a directly impacted person, but that experience does not teach me how to organize. It doesn't teach me how to run a 501c3. It doesn't teach me how to deal with the triggers that I deal with, the trauma of how to actually connect with people. And I don't think that we necessarily always are ready to to think about how to literally, like, we're nurturing movements, right? Nurturing people in this work, remembering the economic instability that many of our folks face. We don't have jobs, we don't have health benefits. So to me, it's about also remembering that we need support and protection for the folks who enter this work, because the state is coming down heavy right now on people of color. The movement for our Black Lives, we see folks out there, police are in full force as paramilitary forces. They're not out there responding as local police, they're responding as they are in a state of war. And the surveillance apparatus, how broad these domestic terrorism cases are, where material support could be anything. It could be interpreted in so many ways that even me sitting here, I can say certain things that someone could take down. So I think we need to be really real about the risks from the state that we face. That isn't to paralyze us. That isn't to say don't do the work. It's to be smart and strategic about making sure we have people who have our back once things happen too.
I just wanted to add, I totally see that it can be dangerous for Muslim activists to speak up, but on the other hand, it can also protect them when they speak up because, like, for example, Shahina, she was actually facing deportation, and she spoke up so much, she became so well known that gave her protection because she actually won her hearing. I think because people knew that she, there would be a lot of mobilization if something happened to her. So, there's two sides to that. And I think also, of course, the more people speak up, the more protected everybody is. If you have one or two people speaking up, they're gonna go after them. But if everybody stands up and speaks up, then everybody's protecting each other.
Say someone? Yeah, my question is for you, the gentleman from Ghana. When you say fight, I hear organize. Am I correct that we're talking about nonviolent organizing, political activism, using the legal system, mass demonstrations, potentially civil disobedience, but in a nonviolent form? Essentially things that Martin Luther King would espouse. Am I drawing these?
I think all welcome to you listed, very much so. I do think self-defense in terms of like communities being able to protect themselves is a fundamental, I don't think undermines the notion of nonviolence, but I think it's fundamental defense for any professionals anywhere possible. And in this climate, when we are seeing increasing attacks on some communities, particularly Black communities, and then to some extent Muslim communities here, I do think that we're not at that place yet. I do think like people do have to think about like how do we figure out ways to also protect ourselves from people that are armed and psychotic and have no qualms about killing us and don't have to worry about a justice system that will hold accountable. But that caveat aside, yes, I mean, I think it is the idea about, because we're never going to be able to match the system by guns, right? They have so many weapons that we can't really take them on, even if we wanted to pursue that route. So we do have to think about, as movements, how do we build power in a way that is really transformative, that really brings in so many people that they have no other choice but to give in. And so yes, organize and all the forms of organizing.
Yeah, and what specific opportunity? I was asked to work with an interfaith coalition to put together a mass demonstration for the anniversary of Martin Luther King's speech at Riverside Church on racism, militarism, and materialism. And that would be April 7th. I think there are opportunities. I was very impressed with the people who spoke about working with labor, working with women, working with different communities, working with schools. Because I think what we need is we need a revitalization of the civil rights movement in the 1960s And we need the mass demonstrations, and then we need the legislation and whatever else that follows with it. But I think you're all doing fabulous work, so I just want to commend you.
I got last one, Catherine, particular testimony.
I would like to ask you, find a way to organize the Muslim together on the masjids. All the Islamic center, they do not fight each other. We need, the first initiative, we should fight each other. I saw so many initiatives work, many work, good works done based on the Qadar or individual, not as a collective together. Please find a way that all these masjids together, more than 50 to 100 masjids in this area, they try to reach each other, working together. That's not happening right now. Find a way, please.
So what I'm hearing is from y'all is coalition building. What I'm hearing is from y'all is coalition building, working together, and so working together and raising up each other's causes, because the time is not so that we can say, oh, that's not my problem and this is not my problem. It is all of our problems. So for you have a question? Okay. Go ahead.
This is going to have to be the last question.
Okay, I don't have a question, I just want to make a comment. I just want to, first of all, my name is Cynthia DeShola Dawkins. I am the founder of the Timothy Dawkins Project and the co-founder of the Coalition for Concerned Mothers. I'm the vice president of that organization. And I also want to say the ideal that you have about putting together film to educate people is an excellent ideal, because that's what I do with the Timothy Dawkins Project. I've been showing a film called Making a Killing, Guns, Greed, and the NRA, produced by Robert Greenwald, and that has been very, has showed very positive effects on the community. People have been educating people through film on how the NRA are creating fear in our community and having people believe that they must have a gun to protect themselves while they make money off of regular citizens. So that's one thing I wanted to add. And let you know that that is another tactic, because we live in a push-button society where people don't want to read. I am also a substitute teacher, so I know our children do not want to read. When I say it's time to get on the computer, they are so excited. So that helps. And it's not only with the children, but the adults are also, finding, the social media, all those kinds of things. People don't want to pick up a book anymore. People want to see a film. They don't want to have to take the time to read something. They want to see it. And, that's when it's most effective. Yes, people are beginning to be more visual learners. So I just want to commend you on that idea.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our